The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. The Redeemer's Coming by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. 8. Genetics. After Brother Peter's somewhat rudimentary outlines, I understood what was going on and immediately jumped up, grabbed my doctor's bag and ran straight towards the library, while the vicar, who also did not give himself a break, immediately clung to my heels. Lestrade and Holmes followed with a bit of a distance. Arriving at the library, I couldn't spot Brother Nicholas at first. Only Brother Peter led me through the labyrinth of bookshelves into a side room. It was the one with the indexed books. There, Brother Nicholas laid on the ground in a large pool of blood. Immediately I saw the wound in the back of his head. The librarian had fallen onto the ground, the back side of his head facing towards the top. Obviously, this accident was brought about with human influence. I bent over him and felt his pulse on his neck, but I couldn't feel a heartbeat. I turned the body around with considerable effort, but in all consequence I had to acknowledge that the librarian could no longer be helped. "He's dead," I resignedly said, as Holmes and Lestrade arrived after the vicar. "Oh, no," cried Brother Peter. "What a misfortune!" "Was it a misfortune?" asked Holmes immediately. "It wasn't an accident, that is for sure," I explained. "At this stage I would say that Brother Nicholas lost consciousness and fell to the ground. Due to his deep wound on the back of his head, he also lost a lot of blood. He had no chance of survival. However, this wound does not stem from the fall itself, but is, on the contrary, etiologic. It was inflicted on him by a violent blow with a hard object. What we are dealing with is another devious murder." "For heaven's sake," lamented the otherwise brisk vicar, "that will not please the papal envoy at all." "Rightly so," said Lestrade. "My patience is coming to an end too. Surely it is not acceptable for a spiritual serial offender to lead us around in this way. Holmes, what do you intend to do now?" The addressee remained calm and looked around the room. "I will inspect the crime scene," he said. "What else?" "And what do you see?" the inspector asked immediately. "As Dr. Watson suggested," Holmes began, "the attack took place from behind, according to the pattern of the attack on Brother Emmanuel. The crime weapon may have been similar or even the same. Brother Nicholas was surprised, beaten down, and fatally wounded. But what has he done here? In any case, he did not put back the critiques on the Elements of the Philosophy of Right by Hegel, since it is still standing on the desk. Watson, what book is open at the table here?" In fact, a small ribbon was placed on the small table next to the dead. The suspicion was that the librarian was devoting himself or dedicating himself to this reading. I slammed the book and read on the front, "Experiments on Plant Hybrids, in German, by a certain Gregor Mendel, born 1866. "A work on botany," said Lestrade disapprovingly. "I don't know how experimental gardening will help us here." "It's much more than that," said Holmes, who apparently already knew this script. "Mendel, an Austrian Augustinian abbot, undertook cross-breeding experiments with pea plants over several generations, evaluated them statistically, and thus developed general views on the theory of inheritance. Although committed to the Catholic Church, Mendel came to results that could not only confirm Darwin's central findings, but could evolve on important issues. But this is controversial, and not only on the Church side." "Why this?" I asked, and I was a little ashamed that, as a medical doctor, I'd never heard of. "Well, that's because of the possible practical application of the findings," Holmes said. "When we get behind the mystery of the inheritance of certain characteristics, discover real laws of inheritance, this ultimately allows for the targeted breeding of new species by crossing, at least the promotion of desired characteristics. Just imagine that we would do this not only with pea plants, but with animals or even with humans. You could create perfect specimens. Evolution would be in our hands." "It is not for man to play God," the vicar shouted in a strict tone. I was not comfortable with this idea either, although I looked at it from a purely scientific point of view. "Evolution is based on coincidences and adaptations to external influences, trial and error, repetition and success," I argued. Perhaps one should let nature run its course and not strive to eliminate chance, to create a superhuman in order to get only a new Frankenstein monster. I won't deny potential issues, Holmes said, not least the possibility of abuse. But also think of the positive things one does with that knowledge. Hereditary damage could be eradicated, diseases defeated, and better conditions for human physical and mental health could be created. I shook my head, shuddering. I don't like that, I insisted. Holmes smiled at me good-naturedly. I didn't even know, he said, that you are so bull-headed, my dear Watson. Doesn't it appeal to you? I hesitated with my answer, but then I explained. Once human beings are made of the best possible design, humanity is divided into superior and inferior specimens, into modern and old, into valuable and disposable. It will all depend on the people that will be able to afford to have only highly intelligent, talented, and strong children, and who does not. What entity will control this? We will distinguish between worthy and less worthy life, between livable and redundant life. At the end of this path, inevitably, is selection, not natural one, but authoritarian one. And this, in turn, leads straight to the so-called euthanasia, which I totally reject. In short, I fear a genocide of unprecedented proportions. My concern seemed to have reached Holmes, because he remained silent for some time. In fact, he must have had no counter-arguments, because he decided to ridicule my fears. Don't worry, Watson, he assured in a confident voice. Once the world is populated with others like me, and I think that is what concerns you, I will put a good word for you and save you from selection with all sincerity, because I still need you. My friend knew, of course, that I was not satisfied with this answer, but I noted that it was the wrong time for an in-depth discussion, and Holmes's appreciative words at the end, which were rare at that, softened my distress. So all I said was, Well, Holmes, if you promise to me faithfully. Gentlemen, Lestrade finally threw in, do we know if this book has anything to do with the murder? Can't it just be here by chance? We'll find out, Holmes said as he took the booklet. But one thing is certain, coincidences may exist in evolution and natural inheritance, but not in crime. We returned to the dining room, while the vicar summoned some brothers to remove the body and cleanse the crime scene from the blood. It was certainly a very unpleasant activity, but to be fair, the friars were accustomed to a certain level of inconvenience. When we met the abbot at his belated lunch, he was shaken up by the additional murder. Brother Nicholas was my oldest companion here in the monastery, he said. We prayed and worked together for almost 40 years. He was probably the only one within these walls that I would call a friend. My condolences, Holmes replied before putting Mendel's book on the table. Brother Nicholas had apparently just read this book. Does this tell you anything? Does it have a special meaning? The abbot took the scripture in his hand and answered, I have not seen this for a long time. Our esteemed colleague from Brno is, probably without knowing, going on a limb. He always believed in the compatibility of religion and science. Unfortunately, he died recently. You knew Mr. Mendel personally? Holmes asked. Quite right, confirmed the abbot. Brother Gregory was once in London. It must have been more than 20 years ago, as a participant in the Moravian delegation to the World Exhibition. At that time he had only just started his experiments, and I was very interested as a doctor. We remained in contact with letters for a long time. But aren't his laws of inheritance causing difficulties to Christian dogmas? I interjected. Yes, Brother Francis replied. Of course, the creation of God is sacrosanct as a unique act. However, if it was an intelligent design, and we want to assume that, it does not necessarily rule out further development. And by the way, human intervention is not ruled out as well. If man is to subdue the world, flora and fauna, he acquires necessary means. Some of them he already uses. He domesticates animals and cultivates crops. He rotates plants and animals. He spreads seeds to other continents and breeds crossbreeds. And if, in the end, the result is a better world, it is certainly pleasing to God. But for heaven's sake, and the abbot added a wink, don't tell anyone in the Vatican. They seem to have more issues on subjects like these. I had to smile at the pragmatism of Brother Francis. Yes, I even admired him a little. In any case, this approach terrified me far less than the utopia of the superhuman, as Holmes had painted. Did you experiment on plants yourself?" asked Holmes. "Only in the rose garden," replied the abbot, "but that was a long time ago. I don't really remember." "I understand," Holmes said. "And Brother Nicholas?" "He had nothing left for things like that," Brother Francis replied. "His interest in this and similar writings was purely to preserve knowledge, as it should be for a good librarian." With these words the abbot rose. "So, if you would please accept my apologies, I have to prepare a funeral," he said, getting ready to leave the room. "Of course," Holmes replied, "but may I have the book? It may be evidence." Brother Francis still held Mendel's writing in one hand, his walking stick in the other. "Oh, forgive me," he said quickly. "Sometimes I have my head in the clouds." The abbot presented Holmes with the book, nodded, said goodbye, and walked away. When we were alone, Holmes began, "Let's put aside the doctrine of inheritance, blasphemous or not. The fact is, our only witness was murdered just before he could give us the name of the alleged perpetrator. At least, that is certainly no coincidence. Obviously, he had to be silenced in time. But how did the perpetrator know? You might think these walls have ears." "Can we finally start with questioning the other brothers?" suggested Lestrade. "In a proper police interrogation, the perpetrator may cave in and make a comprehensive confession. I know the methods and tactics to this." Holmes thought little of these methods and tactics, as I knew. He repeatedly referred to them as crude and clumsy. But in the given situation it was difficult to deny the inspector his wish. "As you wish," Holmes replied, "but don't immediately go like a bull to the gate. It is necessary that you do the opposite. Proceed with caution and care. We should not underestimate our perpetrator. He has already demonstrated what he is capable of." "All right, just let me show you," Lestrade proclaimed undeterred, "what Scotland Yard is capable of. The British police should not be underestimated either." "Don't worry," Holmes replied. "That's hardly possible."